Good morning, Year 6. Mrs. Mehebi here again for day 2 of your English. So this week we were writing first person recount of the sinking of the Titanic. And we started planning yesterday and we were going to do 4 paragraphs. Today we are just going to write paragraph 1. And when I say just, it will take a lot of planning and careful writing and meeting success criteria. Yesterday we split it up into 4 paragraphs and we did start to plan each one. So we had paragraph 1, the one we're writing today, has a bit of an introduction and the part where Titanic hits the iceberg and you get into a lifeboat. Paragraph 2 was rowing away from the Titanic as it started to sink. Paragraph 3 was to describe the sinking, and paragraph 4 was afterwards. Yesterday we looked at what was in each paragraph. So for paragraph 1, we're going to have a look at this in more detail today. So we've got the introduction, hits the iceberg, lifeboat, music, because we wanted that realistic detail of the orchestra playing, the calm, then the tension, and describing it being lowered down into the sea. So my notes that I made yesterday I'm going to include in my writing. So I've got introduction. We want to convey that this person has been through a traumatic experience. So I had handshaking, tears, being overcome with grief and shock, maybe numbness, hitting the iceberg, that they didn't hear it, but they felt the shudder of it, and it awoke them from their slumber. So I was already thinking about the words I wanted to use. Then we've got the show don't tell. I clutched my mother's hand as we boarded the lifeboat. And the calmly, to show that at first everything was calm. Nobody panicked to start with. We could hear the orchestra playing. Then the calmness starts to fade. So I'm going to describe the tension, maybe the looks on people's faces. The lifeboat being lowered, the ropes maybe getting stuck. It taking an age to get to the sea. Then I'm going to use some language to describe the sea, the deepness, the darkness of it. And to finish my paragraph, this first part of the unoccupied spaces in the lifeboats, they weren't full. And that's something that was true at the time, so we need to mention that. So unoccupied spaces, and that meant a lot more people died. So I've got a simile like unmarked gravestones staring up at the star-speckled sky. And maybe a reaction at the end, a shiver ran down my spine. So when we want to start writing that, this is my introduction. My hands are shaking, semicolon. I feel hot tears struggling against my eyes, and I have no idea where to begin. I feel a driving need to tell everything properly, exactly as it happened. But my mind is cluttered with exhaustion, confusion, and despair, and grief. Semicolon, I am overcome by grief. So I've got a little bit of repetition here and a semicolon to really convey that this person has been through a traumatic experience. That's my introduction to the paragraph. So my next part is it hits the iceberg. You can hear the scrape of the iceberg as it glanced by the underbelly of the ship. We felt it though, as it awoke us from our slumber. So 2 sentences, nice and easy. Didn't hear it, but we felt it. It awoke us from our slumber. Next part of my first paragraph, I need it to be calm and I need the realistic details, the orchestra playing. So calmly, an adverb opens to my sentence. Families had begun to gather in the first class lounge. So I've got some realistic detail of where they were, whilst the orchestra played to the sound of families chatting casually. So I've got a conjunction whilst, and I didn't want to say families talking. Chatting does sound more casual and relaxed. Whilst the orchestra played to the sound of families chatting casually, nobody was panicking. So my next couple of sentences. On the lifeboat, my show don't tell, and describing the tension starting to rise. So I've got a fronted adverbial of time here. After a short while, we were ushered by an important looking man into lifeboat 5. I clutched my mother's hand tightly as we gingerly took our seats. That shows the nervousness. We could still hear, so I've got the sound, 5 senses, we could still hear the orchestra playing in the first class lounge. Then I want to describe this tension rising, so I want to have a dash here. We could still hear the orchestra playing in the first class lounge. Dash. The calm music and mismatched soundtrack to the tension rising amongst those of us on the lifeboat. In contrast to the soothing sounds drifting through the frigid air, so I've got lots of description in here. We've got the soothing sounds, an effective verb, they're drifting through the frigid air. An argument between our officer and the man who loaded us onto the lifeboat set my hair on end. And then I'm going to just say it now. We realised it was serious. We slowly began to realise the severity of the situation. So my next part is, then we got lowered into the sea. Let's see how I'm going to write this in a more interesting way. The lowering of the boat into the sea seemed to take an age. I could put a full stop there, but I want to really describe this. So I'm going to put a semicolon. I need another independent clause. The ropes repeatedly stuck in the pulleys as we were hung above the glassy surface of the water below. Okay, I've already got what we could hear, but I could see now. I could see my father's concerned face staring down from above. And it wasn't smooth going down, so I'm going to have this. The jolt and the jerk of a downward journey finally ended in the sea. Another semicolon here, and this is that description I mentioned I was going to get in. In the deep darkness of the night, it looked as black as oil, lapping against our boat gently. Okay, so far I've got the introduction. My hands are shaking, I'm overcome with grief. Hits the iceberg, didn't hear it, but we felt it. Then I've got the calm, going to wait for the lifeboat, getting on and being lowered into the sea, and the tensions rising. So the last part of the paragraph is realising it's not full. So I've got whilst I looked, so I've got a variety of sentence openers. Whilst I looked around the lifeboat, it suddenly became clear to me that our craft was only half full. Dash again to get the extra detail. So this is my literary language and my simile. The unoccupied spaces on the benches faced up towards a star-speckled night, like unmarked gravestones. And here I said at the end we were going to have a reaction. A shiver ran down my spine. End of the first paragraph. Always really good if you read it back to yourself, so we're going to do that now. So my hands are shaking. I feel hot tears struggling against my eyes, and I have no idea where to begin. I feel the driving need to tell everything properly, exactly as it happened. But my mind is cluttered with exhaustion, confusion and despair, and grief. I am overcome by grief. I didn't hear the scrape of the iceberg as it glanced by the underbelly of the ship. We felt it, though, as it awoke us from our slumber. Calmly, families had begun to gather in the first class lounge, whilst the orchestra played to the sound of families chatting casually. After a short while, we were ushered by an important-looking man into Lifeboat 5. I clutched my mother's hand tightly as we gingerly took our seats. We could still hear the orchestra playing in the first class lounge. The calm music and mismatched soundtrack to the tension rising among those of us on the lifeboat. In contrast to the soothing sounds drifting through the frigid air, an argument between our officer and the man who loaded us onto the lifeboat set my hair on end. We slowly began to realise the severity of the situation. The lowering of the boat into the sea seemed to take an age. The ropes repeatedly stuck in the pulleys as we were hung above the glassy surface of the water below. I could see my father's concerned face staring down from above. The jolt and the jerk of our downward journey finally ended in the sea. In the deep darkness of the night, it looked as black as oil, lapping against our boat gently. Whilst I looked around the lifeboat, it suddenly became clear to me that our craft was only half full. The unoccupied spaces on the benches faced up towards the star-speckled night, like unmarked gravestones. A shiver ran down my spine. So that is our first paragraph. We're not watching Titanic sink yet. Nothing else has happened. So our success criteria for the first paragraph, and you can check yours against this, is precise, well-chosen vocabulary. So I've got scrape, glanced, slumber, important looking, brief. Range of conjunctions to give extra detail. As, whilst, show don't tell, clutched my mother's hand. Variety of sentence openers. So there's calmly, after a short while, whilst. Realistic detail. So we've got lifeboat number 5, the orchestra playing. A dash to help it illustrate the tension. The calm music and mismatched. So we had that sentence to illustrate how the tension was building. Semicolons to emphasize emotions, and grief. I had a full stop, but we've got a semicolon. I am overcome by grief. And another semicolon to emphasize the length of time it actually took you to be lowered into the sea. The ropes repeatedly stuck. You're describing it in more detail here. Effective verbs, we've got jolt, we've got jerk. Then we've got our literary language. We've got deep darkness, black as oil, the glassy surface, the star-speckled night, like unmarked gravestones. So we've got our simile in there as well. That is your first paragraph. Do not write your second one. If you want to go back to planning and adding a few more phrases and things you might want to use in your second one, that's fine. But take your time writing your first paragraph today. Okay, and I will be back with you tomorrow.